In business and in sports and in politics, there is a pervasive language of war and of conflict. We talk of market penetration, of invading new markets. We outflank our opponents. We get ambushed in office meetings. We form alliances and we engage in battle against alliances. We conduct hasty retreats when facing a superior foe. We arrange a truce or we make peace with our rivals. Perhaps it's only natural that we should speak this way. There is a reason. Ours is a world of conflict and cooperation, and sometimes the cooperation seems only a prelude to conflict. Rather than simply adopting the machismo of war words, we can go beyond the surface similarities. We can study and learn something about strategy from the actual techniques of martial combat. Here, we look at some of the tactical techniques utilized by the military and codified in military manuals worldwide. Successful strategic implementation means following through with crisp execution. It means knitting together your tactical engagements in the service of your master plan. Let's revisit a terminology issue right at the start, the difference between strategy and tactics. The difference between strategy and tactics has always seemed slippery to many people. Sometimes the terms seem to be used interchangeably. There's a very good reason for this confusion. In simplest terms, a strategy is the overall plan, while tactics are the actions you take to execute the plan. Now, this distinction has a long tradition in strategic planning that goes back to the military. This leads to an unfortunate conclusion that strategy refers to the big things and tactics to the details. But as we embark upon our strategic journey into a future that is unsure, there is no way for us to know in advance which details are insignificant and which may loom large as an important strategic milestone for us. Our intended strategy merges imperceptibly into our emergent strategy through the process of strong and crisp execution and responses to what our competitors do. Perspective also plays a major role. Strategic theorist Richard Rumelt put it this way: one person's strategy is another's tactics. That is, what is strategic depends on where you sit. For instance, from the overall perspective of corporate strategy, business units are expected to execute tactics. But from the perspective of a single unit within the business, these tactics for the overall company are likely part of the strategy for the business unit. There may be subunits to execute the tactics of that unit's strategy, what from the top level might be regarded as logistics or operations. Now, the important point to remember is this: execution is the neglected child of strategy, and that follow-through in our execution, our tactics, is a more important part of strategy than the publication of our strategy in a handsome binder. So let's call these techniques strategic maneuvers. As we employ them, let's keep our eyes open for opportunities to change directions, to abandon plans that are gone awry, to follow up victories with more victories, and to allow our realized strategy to emerge from the flurry of actions and responses that play out in the real world. Generals use a variety of strategic maneuvers on the battlefield to engage the enemy. Many of these maneuvers have a long history, some thousands of years old, which suggests their conceptual durability as well as the constancy of human nature. Maneuvers effective in the 1st century BC can be just as effective in the 21st century because the challenges at bottom remain the same: dealing with human nature in conflict. Now, these principles of maneuver can be applied at the level of the army with its thousands of armed combatants down to the level of the individual swordsman. Moreover, these maneuvers have their counterparts in other venues, such as business and in sports. In fact, the lines between these separate venues are blurred and are different only in the level of conflict and the degree of violence. The maneuvers can be faster than the speed of conscious thought. Think for a moment of an individual swordsman, today's elegant modern-day sport of fencing using the tip of a foil to touch a midsection, or the saber to touch anywhere on the upper body, or the tip of the épée to touch anywhere on the entire body, are all direct descendants from military training rapier. As a young college fencer, I found that one learns the same attacks and defensive maneuvers utilized by warriors in centuries past, warriors who played for the much higher stakes of life and death. Let's take a closer look now at some of these maneuvers. Fencing is an elegant sport, a sport of strength, endurance, speed, and guile. Now this is a saber. This is a cutting and a thrusting weapon. We want to score touches on our opponent. The target area of our opponent is everything above the waist, the torso, the arms, wrists, and the head. Protection is essential. Our basic attacks are the chest or belly cut, the flank cut, and the head cut straight on or to either cheek. I can also lunge and thrust with the point of the blade. My opponent attempts to parry these attacks. He parries the flank cut. He parries the chest cut. He parries the head cut. Now, I want to deceive my opponent. I want him to develop tendencies so that he exposes himself to my attack. In this case, an attack to the wrist. Flank cut, parried. Chest cut, parried. Flank cut, parried. Chest cut. It was a feint. Cut to the wrist. The same technique for the head cut. Head cut, parried. Head cut, parried. Head cut. It was a feint. Cut to the chest. These are just a few of the deception techniques we can use. Saber fencing, of course, is much more than hand movement. We incorporate mobility. In this case, the lunge. And finally, we conclude our brief demonstration with a running attack called a flesh attack. Now, in all of this, your opponent's responses combine with learned martial principles to create a dynamic and fluid combat situation. It is from this interaction of strategic maneuvering that the final result emerges. Of course, there is no checklist for successful fencing, much less for actual conflict. You may go into your conflict with a checklist, always beginning in the on-guard position, but you will surely be left behind when dealing with an experienced opponent. You must be ready to abandon your line of attack to create and pursue other momentary advantages that present themselves and to exploit them with follow-through. Fencing and the speed at which it takes place helps us understand a broader fact about conflict and competition. After the battle or a series of battles, in hindsight, we might identify a strategy pursued that actually did not exist in your prior intent. This is an important point to remember in studying the great battles and great business moves of history. What actually occurred was often not the result of a carefully wrought strategic plan, but the consistent, swift, and flexible application of martial principles at the place and time demanded of the situation. Now, with this fact in mind, let us examine some of these martial principles and strategic maneuvers. Let's first recognize that not every maneuver or attack is appropriate in every situation. It must make sense. It must make sense in the overall plan. It must make sense in the context of the ongoing battle. And it must make sense given what has already occurred and our current capabilities. It must, in short, have strategic fit. An example of the elusiveness of victory in the quest for strategic fit comes from the Vietnam War. Colonel Harry Summers authored a book about the war, a Clausewitzian analysis of U.S. performance. After the war, Colonel Summers was in a delegation dispatched to Hanoi. In the airport, he got into a conversation with a North Vietnamese colonel named Tu, who spoke some English. They spoke of their recent conflict, as warriors might do. Colonel Summers said this, "You know, you never defeated us on the battlefield." Colonel Tu considered his response, and then he replied, "That may be so, but it is also irrelevant." Colonel Tu's point was not cavalier. He described how a powerful opponent, the United States, had pursued a strategy of limited war against a weaker combatant, pursuing a strategy of total war. A powerful opponent that had a muddled strategic intent with unclear objectives, battling an enemy with clear intent and objectives, and pursuing tactics designed to exploit weakness. The weapons, the places, and the times may change, but conflict at its most visceral is still human versus human. And so it's useful for us to learn about some of the more venerable attacks and to examine their applicability in venues other than the actual battlefield. Some techniques of maneuver and attack are familiar to most people, others not so well known. The best strategic maneuver, of course, is one that Sun Tzu recommended more than 2,000 years ago. Sun Tzu urged us to consider techniques that would yield bloodless victories. He said this: "To fight and conquer in all your battles is not supreme excellence. Supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting." More often than not, we are not blessed with the kind of acumen or situation that allows us the luxury of winning without battle. And so here we look at 4 techniques that can yield victory if applied judiciously and at the proper place and time. First, the frontal assault. Second, the indirect approach. Third, turning the flank. And fourth, rear area battle. The frontal assault we've already met when discussing the trench warfare of World War I, and is exactly what it sounds like: an all-out attack on the enemy's front. Usually the enemy is well dug in. The opponent has chosen the location where the battle will take place. You have tremendous disadvantages when making a frontal assault. So the natural question arises here is, why use this maneuver, this attack? Is there ever a time when a frontal assault is a good idea? Perhaps. If it is the last thing a competitor expects and believes you will do, even if it's fully expected, it may be the only option available. There may be no other way to oust an opponent from a strong point. In the 8-year Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, the Iranians launched human-wave frontal assaults on the better equipped but outnumbered Iraqis. If you believe your frontal assault is the only option open to you, then you can act to mitigate the disadvantages. And I commend to you the example of D-Day, June 6, 1944, the invasion of Adolf Hitler's fortress Europe. The Allied landings in western France were a frontal assault, the deadliest kind, against a well-prepared and well-entrenched enemy across unfriendly terrain. The Allies chose the French coast as their point of attack, as the Germans knew they would. There was really no other choice. The Allies still had flexibility as to the time and the exact location. These were the factors that the Allies desperately needed to shroud from the Germans. The Allies elected to obfuscate the true landing place and time with an elaborate deception campaign. In business, the frontal assault pits one competitor against another. The manifestation of the frontal assault is the price war, especially when the two businesses compete on price rather than quality or premium brands or service. Take, for instance, the discount retailer Walmart. It fought and won a frontal assault on Kmart in the 1990s. How does one attack Walmart or the big cola companies, Coca-Cola and Pepsi, with a frontal assault? Royal Crown Cola actually tried a frontal assault on the big two colas in the late 1960s. Now, way back in the 1930s, Royal Crown was the #2 soft drink in America, ahead of Pepsi. RC Cola is, in fact, a part of Americana, at least in the American South. The working man's lunch was an RC Cola and a moon pie, and it even yielded a popular song in the 1950s, "Gimme an RC Cola and a moon pie." It remains an expression that to this day has traction in the American South. This kind of word-of-mouth advertising and embedding in the popular culture is considered gold in the marketing world. But RC overreached. By the late 1960s, Royal Crown was America's #3 cola and elected to take on the Big Two. It hired a big city advertising agency, Wells, Rich, Green, led by one of the highest paid advertising executives in the country, Mary Wells. With reckless bravado, Wells made this announcement: "We're out to kill Coke and Pepsi. I hope you'll excuse the word, but we're really out for the jugular." But RC was really in no position to attack the market leaders in a frontal assault. At the time, Pepsi alone was selling 4 times as much as RC Cola. RC dissipated its resources promoting its mainline cola at a time when it had all the elements in place for a different and perhaps more successful strategic maneuver. It's a maneuver we'll talk about in a moment. Frontal assaults between major corporations can devastate the contenders. The only winners in such a venture are consumers. So you and I should be grateful when firms decide to assault each other directly, because the only immediate winners in a price war are consumers. To take an extreme example, in 1992, airlines engaged in a price war so devastating that some observers said airlines lost more money than the total profits earned by the industry since its very beginning. Unless other mitigating factors can be brought to bear, attacking a strong and well-prepared enemy is foolhardy. It goes against every principle of competition we've studied and will study. This is true in professional conflict on a personal level as well. A direct frontal assault on a well-entrenched opponent, especially in public, has a good chance of ending in disaster for the attacker, unless the stage is carefully prepared beforehand and other mitigating factors are on your side, such as timing or location, surprise, and deception. Generally speaking, which is to say most of the time, it's much better to pursue another tack. The indirect approach is one such technique. The indirect approach is a technique that thwarts your opponent's expectations. Your opponent would like nothing better than to have you hurl yourself onto his carefully prepared position. Some enemies are just too strong to tackle head-on, like Walmart. The indirect approach is a strategic contribution offered by Sir Basil Liddellhart, a British strategist of the early and mid-20th century. In his book, Strategy, Liddellhart notes that 7 out of 8 frontal assaults in the American Civil War failed. He also observed that when the art of the indirect approach was used, it demonstrated great utility both in achieving objectives and in minimizing the damage to the attacker. It makes no sense to wear ourselves out on an opponent entrenched in a powerful position. This could be called the Blitzgrinder, which was how the Russians viewed their defensive preparations at the Battle of Kursk in 1943. The Soviets had prepared extensive defensive belts over a period of months, and these successive belts of defenses wore down the massive German offensive so that it never did achieve a breakthrough. In mobile warfare, where maneuver can be used to great effect, a technique of the indirect approach is to keep an opponent guessing as to your intermediate objectives as you advance. And in this way, by keeping 2 equally attractive objectives in the strategic scheme, you impose indecisiveness on your opponent. And in the best case, you compel him to split his forces in a futile attempt to defend everything. William Tecumseh Sherman's 1864 Georgia campaign in the American Civil War offers us an excellent example of keeping the enemy in suspense as to successive objectives. Sherman faced retreating Confederate General Joseph Johnston, and Southern forces were never able to fix Sherman's objectives along his route of march. In business, we can look to Honda Motor Company for an excellent example of the strategy of indirect approach. In Japan, Honda is known as a motorcycle manufacturer, but abroad, it's known for its automobiles, and it is, in fact, the 3rd largest car maker in the United States. But in the 1950s, Honda developed its expertise as the world's best, not in motorcycles, nor automobiles. No. Honda became the world's leading manufacturer of small internal combustion engines, and it still is. American car makers saw Honda as a Japanese maker of small motorcycles, and it ignored Honda's growing expertise in designing the finest small engines in the world, engines that powered everything from snowblowers to chainsaws to lawnmowers to generators to outboard motors. This technological leadership laid a platform for Honda's horizontal expansion, eventually into automobiles. Honda's indirect approach caught American car makers napping. They did not see the immediate threat of a new car maker on the horizon with new ideas about smaller auto design, higher gas mileage, and a reasonable price. Our next strategic maneuver is turning the flank. Turning the flank is a maneuver that attempts to dislocate the enemy by moving to either of his flanks. It is a specific type of indirect approach focused on the opponent's sides. The flanking movement requires a response from the enemy, which usually disrupts its own operations. Napoleon, he crafted much of his reputation by maneuvering against the flanks and into the rear of the enemy. In the Korean War, General Douglas MacArthur's amphibious landing at Incheon was an important example. In the Civil War, General Sherman maneuvered against the enemy flanks many times in his 1864 campaign against the South in Georgia. Repeatedly, Sherman maneuvered to turn the flank of Joseph Johnston's army, forcing the Southern general out of his prepared defensive positions and into successive retreats. On the other side of that war, Southern Commander-in-Chief General Robert E. Lee achieved his greatest victory in 1863 at Chancellorsville by means of the flank attack, and he accompanied his flank attack by the force multiplier of surprise and a bit of deception. Now, Lee combined a distracting demonstration attack on the Union front, while his trusted Lieutenant General Thomas Stonewall Jackson maneuvered quickly and surreptitiously to the unsuspecting Union right flank. Jackson attacked, and he completely surprised and he routed the Union troops, relaxing in their bivouac. In the 2003 motion picture, Gods and Generals, this battle is given a stunning portrayal. In business, attacking the flank can take many different forms, depending on the product or service and the various alignments of power relationships. Attacking the flank can mean, for instance, carving out market space by specializing in a narrow niche of a major competitor. Take retail bookselling, for instance. The specialty bookseller will always outcompete the general interest bookseller within the narrow parameters defined by the niche market. Another example is specialty retail clothing stores for the large man. And finally, going back to our Royal Crown Cola example, we saw how Royal Crown attempted to take on the big two colas and wore itself out promoting its mainline cola against Coca-Cola and Pepsi. But RC could have pursued a different course, one that could have been wildly successful. In 1962, Royal Crown went nationwide with the first diet soft drink in the United States, Diet Right Cola. This flanking move caught the major colas by complete surprise, though Coke responded eventually with Tab and Pepsi came out with Diet Pepsi. By the end of the 1960s, Diet Right was the largest selling soft drink in the United States and accounted for almost half of Royal Crown's earnings. This was the moment of strategic decision for Royal Crown. By concentrating its resources on market leader Diet Right, RC could have solidified its position. RC did not anticipate this development, its market leadership in diet soda. It did choose to squander the opportunity. Rather than show flexibility and follow up on a clear winner, it decided to compete on both fronts and let the market choose for them, with disastrous results. Increased competition appeared in 1982 with the introduction of Diet Coke, and without strategic support, Diet Right faded and eventually slipped to less than 4% of the diet soda market. Such are the results of choosing the wrong strategic maneuver. In this case, electing a frontal assault over following up on a successful flanking maneuver. Similar to the indirect approach in turning the flank is the maneuver called rear area battle. Rear area battle is a concept of 20th century warfare whose operative idea is to sow confusion in the enemy ranks behind the lines by creating the impression that no ground is safe. It forces an opponent to expend resources defending ground that it thought it had already won. And there is a large psychological opponent to this strategic maneuver. In warfare, at the commencement of hostilities, commandos with various deadly skills infiltrate into the enemy's rear areas, where the enemy maintains its support and supply bases. These commandos disrupt communications and supply, and even assassinate enemy commanders, sowing confusion and suspicion. I had the chance to interview a Hungarian defector during the Cold War, a member of an elite commando unit. Hungary, of course, was a member of the Warsaw Pact. Now, these commandos were known as Spetsnaz or Specjalne Nazwanie. This soldier's mission at the commencement of hostilities was to be inserted behind our lines and to attack critical military installations. During World War II, the French underground worked tirelessly against occupying German forces, sabotaging railways and supply lines, aiding downed Allied pilots, and providing the Allies with valuable intelligence. In Russia, too, the partisans took up arms against the German invaders and increased the defensive burden for the Germans, forcing them to use troops to guard supply depots and convoys, diverting these badly needed soldiers from the front lines. Now, just as important as the operational aspects of rear area battle is the psychological impact on your opponent when he realizes that the enemy has penetrated the lines and is behind him. In World War II, at the start of the Battle of the Bulge in 1944, the Germans managed to drop commandos wearing American military police uniforms behind Allied lines. The famed commando Otto Skorzeny spearheaded the operation, which was designed to sow confusion in the American ranks as the Germans pressed forward in their last major offensive of the war. Rear area battle, it can have a powerful impact on an enemy. Again, one psychological thrust is that the enemy is compelled to deploy forces to defend or to regain territory he believed he had already won and secured. The psychological dislocation is tremendous as rear area battle sows insecurity in the mind of the enemy. This type of action is used in presidential political campaigns as candidates strike and counterstrike at each other's home bases with advertising, with personal appearances, and with surrogate campaigners who represent the candidate on the campaign trail. We often hear of how one candidate is campaigning in state thought to be solidly in the other candidate's camp. This has the intended effect of disrupting the plans of the other campaign to force it to redirect resources into areas it thought already secure. Rear area battle, or threat, has been used throughout history to take pressure off other areas of the front. In the summer of 1864, the Confederacy launched its famous Raid on Washington. The South was facing a war of attrition against the North, which it could not hope to win. Ulysses S. Grant was pressing his opposite number at Cold Harbor. To relieve this pressure, Southern General Robert E. Lee formed the Army of the Valley, 10,000 men under General Jubal Early. Lee sent Early north with orders to attack the Union capital, Washington, D.C. Washington was less strongly held than at other points in the war, and Early marched his troops hard. If not for a delaying battle by Northern troops at Monocacy, Early's raid might have truly threatened the Northern capital, and as it was, the intent of the raid was to force Union General Grant to divert troops from its pressure on the South to prevent the seizure of the capital, to defend new territory that was considered secure, but was now suddenly threatened. As an interesting historical aside, it was during this raid by Jubal Early that Abraham Lincoln became the only incumbent U.S. president ever to come under direct fire by an adversary. As Lincoln watched from the stockade parapets that surrounded Washington, Confederate minie-balls whizzed by his head. He was pulled down behind cover by a young captain shouting, "Get down, you fool!" That young captain would later achieve fame in the U.S. judiciary. He was Captain Oliver Wendell Holmes, later Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Rear area battle is used in business quite often, especially in international operations. If we conceive of companies having a home base or a home market, then the analogy becomes clear. For example, in the 1980s, Kodak found itself under assault by Fujifilm in its home market. Fujifilm attacked Kodak in the United States, slowly winning market share at Kodak's expense and igniting a price war. This was a combination frontal assault combined with attacking Kodak's secure U.S. bases. Kodak responded. Kodak responded with a counterattack in Japan, forcing Fujifilm to relook its operations in its home base. Kodak compounded its attack with lawsuits and complaints to the GATT and later the World Trade Organization, charging unfair and illegal Japanese trade practices. Kodak was quite explicit in its aggressive attitude towards Fujifilm. In 1998, Eric L. Steenberg, Kodak's assistant chief operating officer, he offered this belligerent statement of Kodak's strategic intent toward challenger Fujifilm. Smack them until they figure it out. So, which strategic maneuver should you use? Smack them until they figure it out? Or some technique that has a chance of winning the day without a fight? Frontal assault, indirect approach, attack the flank, or take the fight to the rear area of the battle. Now that depends. It depends on your position vis-a-vis your opponent. on your resources, on your capabilities, on your ability to accept risk, on your own strategic intent, and in the implementation of your strategy. It depends on how your opponent responds to your initial and subsequent moves. It also depends on your boldness, on your analytical acumen, and on your ability to see through the fog of conflict in a detached and objective manner. Keep your long-term strategic objectives front and center. Now, successful strategic implementation means knitting together your tactical engagements into a coherent whole. Tactics without an overarching strategy means aimless conflict, perhaps even a string of meaningless tactical victories that weaken you and do not advance your agenda. Even if you know you likely would win such an encounter, shrewd strategic decision-making means not fighting battles that do not advance your strategy.